Welcome everyone. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get logged in from the waiting room and I will get the closed captions running. I always hold my breath when I'm doing this part because it goes on another screen and I'm always afraid it won't come back. But so far so good. Hopefully technology will cooperate with us on this Friday. All right, success. So you should see the red live closed captions box at the top of your screen. It says live on custom streaming service. And I'm going to put that in the chat for everybody. So closed captions. And there's the link for everyone. Well, welcome everyone. Happy Friday. I'm Christy Baglow, the Director of Statewide Training at Florida Legal Services, and I am thrilled to have so many people registered today and so many joining us. We already have 140 and it's only 102. So that just goes to show you that Robin and Walter are rock stars in this world because, it's Friday and they've got a long, instructive webinar planned and you all are here and ready to go. So I love it. Most of you on the call probably already know Robin Rosenberg, a legend in this part of the world. She's the Deputy Director at Florida's Children First. And we also have Walter Hahnemann joining us. He is the supervising attorney of the Children's Advocacy Program at the Legal Aid Service of Broward County. And he will be presenting about the race equity portion of the webinar. And Robin will be handling the main part of the webinar, which is the brave new world of out-of-home care in Florida. So CLE has been approved, so you will be earning 3 CLEs this afternoon, and I'll announce that at the end. And this is also being recorded, so if you miss any part of it, you can go back and watch it later, and that should go out in your email tomorrow. But without further ado, welcome Robin, and thanks for coming back to train us.
Hi, everybody. It's I wish I could say good to see you all, but I can't see you all, but I can see the numbers and saw the registration. So thanks welcome to our training on Brave New World. For those of you who don't know, Florida's Children First is a statewide advocacy organization that concentrates on the rights of children that are served primarily by our child welfare system. There's lots of interesting things that we're in the middle of right now. Not the least of which is the legislative session, which we're right in smack in the middle of. And when it is concluded, we'll be back with another legislative update to let you know how everything's settled out. But for now, we're going to talk about the changes that are coming in out-of-home care in light of the Family First Act. And to make this interactive, we are going to also use Mentimeter. So you can either open a separate window on your computer or take out your phone or tablet or whatever device and go to menti.com. That's MENTI.com. Should be at the top of the screen that you're seeing. And the code for this webinar is 46712905. So we have just some slides at the beginning to help people get used to it. So the first slide is just an open-ended question. What's your role? Are you an attorney, a guardian ad litem? You represent parents? You work for independent living? However you want to describe yourself, go ahead and just type in what is your role. And you can see if you look at the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see how many people have answered so far. So we'll let a few more folks go. And it's very cool. Parent advocate, that's exciting. Family care, child welfare director, licensing, attorney ad litem, managing attorneys, GAL. Some do the acronym, some spell it out. That's great. Okay, so we're glad to have folks from a variety of settings participate in this because the information really is universal and important to everyone. Okay, so let's do the next Menti question. And just how much do you know about the federal requirements of Family First Prevention and Services Act? So right now we're just talking about what the federal law requires for Family First. Okay. I think there was everything. Oh, maybe a lot was the highest one. All right. So kind of a split. Um, give it another minute. So
And I just want to
hopefully,
remind everyone to go enter your information on mentimeter.com if you're able to, because that way it will show up in this cool graphic that Robin has running. If you put it in the chat, we'll see you. We see you. Hello, but it won't go in the cool graphic.
yeah, and
So
I can't look at the chat and what I'm doing now. So
exactly. I
yeah,
see you in the chat, but I put the Mentimeter website and the code there, and I will add that again.
great. Menti.com. Okay, so then let's look at the next one, which is how much do you know about Florida's implementation of Family First? So maybe you haven't heard about the law so much, but you've been hearing things about what Florida is doing to get ready to implement additional provisions. And specifically today, we're talking about out-of-home care. So um, the things that relate to that. All right. So our allot people, if you were in the room with me, I'd be able to call on you to help uh, enlighten us with additional knowledge. I'm sorry I can't do that, but you do have the chat where you can talk to each other. So glad to know that some of you know a lot, and I'm glad for those who maybe don't know anything or a little bit, hopefully by the end of the session, you will know a lot more. I'm going to leave that screen up, but I'm going to switch over to the PowerPoint. And this is an overview of the session. So let me just start out by saying that after the training, you will receive a PDF with all of the PowerPoint slides. So you don't need to copy things or take screenshots. You will get all of the slides. And there'll also be a resource document with some additional materials that you might find useful. So this is basically what we're going to go over today. And let's get started. So the first section that I want to talk about is actually not Family First, but it really has a big effect on young people who are out of their homes. And that is the Supporting Foster Youth and Families Through the Pandemic Act. This was Division 10 of the Consolidated Appropriations Act, which was enacted on December 27th, 2020. And that big last stimulus bill under President Trump had this particular law was a part of that bill, and a big chunk of money went along with it. And my great toggling skills, we're going to go back to Menti. And let me just ask you the question. Do you personally know any former foster youth who are experiencing difficulties due to the pandemic? And this is young people. They may be in extended foster care. They may be getting pests. They may be living in the community. You may know them because they're homeless. You know, you've heard things from the young people that you work with who may know some other people. So these are folks, and we're going to see in a minute, it's a pretty broad age range that are covered by this federal law and the funding that came with it. So this is it's like a scary thing and an exciting thing, because there are a lot of young people in the community who have a lot of serious needs. But the federal government really stepped up, and there's an opportunity to help and serve those young people. So Florida gets, every year, we get about $7.5 million from the federal government under the Chafee law. That is our allotment. And Chafee money is used for part of what we pay for PES, for post-secondary education services and supports, part of the independent living services that we provide to children, and used in part for aftercare and direct financial assistance. So in a normal year, we get $7.5 million. And basically, a lot of the CBCs get an allotment from that Chafee money. It's part of what they get from DCF to serve older foster youth and young adults. Under the law that was passed in December, The federal government gave Florida an additional 19.9791 million dollars. So Florida basically got 20 more million dollars to spend because of the pandemic, much of which must be spent by September of this year. Now, it's possible that they're going to stretch it out and be able to extend the time on that. But right now, it's meant to be spent now. And the bill was passed in December. The money was sent to Florida on February 22nd of this year. I've given you the link for the program instruction from the Children's Bureau, because we've been inquiring from DCF ever since the bill passed in December. How are you going to use it to help kids? How are you going to use it to help kids? And the response has been, we're waiting for the federal government to give us guidance. So the guidance was issued on March 9th, and a copy of that will be in the materials that are in the handout that you're going to get. So just yesterday, the Annie E. Casey Foundation published a brief report on who is eligible in your state to get the money. And you'll see highlighted in Florida the number of young people 14 to 17, and then the 18 to 23 and 24 to 26. So it's a large number of children, and they also calculate how many of them are currently in care. So you'll see on the left-hand side of that slide, the graphic about why this matters. And nationwide, 85% of the young people who are eligible to benefit from those funds are not currently in care. In Florida, that percent is 91. So they're not kids that we immediately have our hands on, but they're eligible for assistance under this law. It's a shocking number, and it's a lot of money to help them. So I want to talk to you about the requirements from that the law that was passed in December and how they affect different young people in different ways. So the first thing they affect is extended foster care. The federal government has required a moratorium on exit from care based on age from December 27th of 2020, when the bill was passed, to September 30th, 2021. So in Florida, if a young person has remained in continuing care for young adults, which we commonly call extended foster care, normally when they turn 22 or 23 if they have a disability, but normally when they turn 21, they have to leave extended foster care. The federal government has made it clear that they must be allowed to stay in care, even if they're older than the normal age that we accept kids in care. They also have specifically required that the state reach out and find anyone who did age out of care because of age and invite them to come back in. And right now, that time frame is if they've aged out from January to April, coming up April, they have to be invited back in. In addition to waiving that age requirement for extended foster care, the federal government has waived the education and employment requirements. So normally a young person in extended foster care has to be, what I say, doing something meaningful. They either have to be going to school, working part-time, enrolled in a program that helps them overcome barriers to employment, or have a disability that precludes that. That participation requirement is waived for young people in extended foster care. So those young folks should be encouraged to stay in and brought back in if they would like to do that. The next piece that changed is education training vouchers, ETV. So most people in Florida are not used to using the term ETV. ETV is a pot of federal money that comes in that is used to support young people who are in higher education. So as a practical matter, Florida uses ETV as the first pot of money that they pay out in PES. And so you apply for PES, you don't separately apply for ETV. For this temporary period, the amount of ETV money per student is increased from $5,000 to $12,000. So that means Florida can take that additional $7,000 and put it toward PES if a young person is already in PES. But where this can make a difference for other young people is the ETV requirements are broader than the PES requirements. So if you are working with a young person who is either studying out of state, if they're attending college outside of Florida, they're not eligible for PES. Or if they're attending school less than full time, they're not eligible for PES. But they are eligible for ETV. And so if they're receiving ETV now, that money can be bumped up. And if they're not receiving it now, that you should help them apply for it because that money is there to help those young people. Excuse me. In addition to those specific programs that we already had, the guidance memo from the Children's Bureau was really clear that they want the states to use this money to facilitate quick and streamlined access to direct financial support for youth who are or were in care. They contemplate sending money directly to young people. So this is not a you know mess around kind of thing. I mean, there are some states that are looking at their allotment and looking at their population, doing the math and planning to send out money, transfers, checks, debit cards, whatever. So we don't know what Florida is planning to do, but the feds have made it clear this is emergency money. We want it spent. We want it to get out there. Right now, the mechanism that Florida has for young people to ask for that kind of financial assistance is if they're not in PES or EFC, that they can apply for aftercare. Our aftercare law and rules are a little narrow, and but the federal guidance is really clear. This money is meant to get into hands of young people. In addition, they specifically note that there might be current processes that are in place, and so that could be a barrier for young people. So right now, for aftercare, there's an aftercare application and an aftercare plan, and those in some places, if those forms are not filled out properly and I's dotted and T's crossed, it could be a long time before the young person gets help. And this guidance is saying, cut through the barriers, get to help the young people as quickly as you can. They've extended the population of who's eligible to get the benefit of these federal CHAFE money. So the eligibility goes to anyone who experienced foster care at age 14 and has not yet reached the age of 27. And the really significant thing in this is it's very clear that includes youth who were reunified after the age of 14. So if they were in care, if they were in foster care, 14 or older, and subsequently reunified, they are eligible for the money under this $20 million pot of money. Likewise, young people who are adopted or placed into guardianship after age 16. So, Florida, we have that little bit of a limitation adoption or guardianship, if they've been 6 months in licensed care, those are the young people that are eligible for some independent living benefits. That restriction is not in there. Another waiver or change is how much of that money can be used for room and board. So ordinarily, the CHAFE money has a limitation. The state cannot spend more than 30% for room and board. That limitation is temporarily lifted. The other really interesting thing they put in there specifically is driving and transportation assistance. And Florida really is the model for the nation and having the keys to independence. And there have been some bills that have tried to do federally to promote driving assistance in other states, and they put some of the money where the mouth is, and they say that up to $4,000 a year per person can be used for driving assistance. This specifically includes assistance in purchasing an automobile. So if you've got a young person, hopefully they've been through the keys, they have their license, they have their insurance. This actually could be used to assist them in purchasing an automobile. So pretty dang exciting. The federal guidance specifically lists what they think the money should be used for. Unrestricted financial assistance, either a one-time payment or a monthly payment. Payments that would allow young people to remain at home if it's not safe for them to be out in public, to go to work, etc., that they should be able to remain at home. That can include living expenses, technology if they need assistance with that, respite for pregnant and parenting young people, medical expenses not covered by insurance, PPE, and that last category, services and support to combat social isolation. That could be sending them care kits, games, things that keep them connected. So those are all appropriate uses for, I'm going to say it again, $20 million of federal funds that are available. So here are advocacy tips. Think about the young people that you know who were eligible, who left care at 21 and maybe are struggling or floundering and not really in a stable housing situation. Let them know about the moratorium, that they are allowed to return to care if that's what they want to do. Um, since Florida has not set up a separate process for return to care, use the existing application, make the motions. Just because a process is not set out for you, make your own process. It's an opportunity. Likewise, when you come across young people who have unmet needs during the pandemic, help them apply for the financial assistance to meet those needs. Just because no one sent a form out, you have to jump into it, because often when you ask for help for young people, there's not any money there. Right now, the money is there. And if it's not used, it goes away. So ask for it. And like I said, your young people who are currently getting ETV or would be eligible for ETV, ask for the greater funding. At the bottom of this is an advocacy resources. There is a Google folder put together by the Juvenile Law Center and some other folks that share motions that they've made in their states. There isn't any Florida specific motions, but you can take a look at how other advocates are addressing those needs. So, and again, their advocacy tips will be in the resource document that you'll get at the end of the training. So, let me take a look at the time. So I think we have, Christy, I have time for maybe one question at the end of this section. If there's something that you saw that I can answer real quickly.
Sounds good. We did have a question about the Chaffee money. Are there ways to spend some of that money so that it contributes to more long-term sustained support for youth, for example, supportive housing, or does it have to be spent on immediate needs like stipends and rent?
So there's no prohibition, and I love whoever wrote that question. Like, what a great question. So find a sustainable way to use these funds. The funds are going to go away right now. They're going to go away in September. So you can't set up, say, a supportive housing coach that's going to continue on for 2 years, because you can't say that the money is going to be there for 2 years. But if there are things that you can do to help get that stability that will continue past the pandemic, then go for it. There is no limitation. That list of things that it can be spent for is really, use that as a starting point, right? Be creative. Lawyers out there, use your legal muscles, put on your thinking caps and come up with great ideas for people, because the opportunities, there are opportunities, not limitations. So awesome question.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. So let's go into the next section. Real quickly, I'm going to talk about the FYI and the FUP housing vouchers. So going back to our overarching concept of what we're doing for out-of-home care, these are federal housing vouchers that young people are eligible for. They're essentially Housing and Urban Development HUD Section 8 vouchers that enable people who hold the voucher to find rental units in their community that will accept that voucher. So if you're familiar with Section 8, they're essentially their Section 8 vouchers. So you may have heard of Family Unification Vouchers, FUP. They've been around since 1990. In 2000, young people also became eligible for them. We use these a lot for parents who need stable housing to be able to get their children back or keep their children. So they're an incredible tool. I think about 5 or 6 housing authorities in Florida use the FUP vouchers, possibly more. Um, when they are used for families, there's no limitation on how long the voucher is good. When they're used for young people, there's a maximum of 36 months they can get the voucher. But there's a limited number of vouchers and they're obtained in a competitive program. So in 2019, young people advocated directly with the Secretary of HUD for additional vouchers that they call foster youth to independence vouchers. And these vouchers are for young people between 18 and 25 who've left foster care or will be leaving within the next 90 days and are either were homeless or are at risk of homelessness. These vouchers are eligible for 36 months. And the difference between the FUP voucher and the FYI voucher is the youth must be offered community services to support them in becoming independent. So FYI vouchers require a partnership between the local child welfare agency, and that can either be DCF or the CBC, and some other supportive type of organization. When they first started, a lot of people didn't use them because if your community already got FUP vouchers for families, you couldn't also get FYI vouchers. But that rule changed. And so now communities, housing authorities can offer both sets of vouchers. And they're much more available on demand, up to 50 in a non competitive process, even more in a competitive process. So Brevard is a leading example in the state of Florida where Brevard Ready for Life, which is an independent living program, has partnered with the local housing authority. They were among the first in the nation to get FYI vouchers for young people, and they've been very successful with that. And they're very happy to talk to folks if they want to expand FYI in their communities. Um, so the my advocacy tip on this though is delay gratification. If we can serve young people and their housing needs through extended foster care, through PES, through aftercare, as long as those services are available, and especially now when there's a big chunk of money, then look, keep your eye on the FYI voucher because while it has to be acquired when the young person is 24, it can go then for those 3 years till they're 27. So don't jump to it first, but make sure they're developed in your community so that you can make them available going forward. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to the placement provisions in the Families First Act, which is Family First Prevention and Services Act, but we like to call it Family First because that's what it's all about. The whole purpose of the act is to keep children with their families whenever possible. And there's a huge topic about prevention services, but that is not our topic today. We're talking about kids who are in out of home care. So if they can't stay home, then to place them with their family or their fictive kin. Those are the people that are, my aunts and uncles who are my parents' good friends, people that are close to them that are not technically relatives. And only if their family is not available, then place them in a family foster home. Group care as a placement option is disfavored and should only be used as an intervention because the young person needs the specific thing that the group home offers, not because we can't find somewhere else for them to stay. So, and that comes the fundamental premise of this bill is the cost effectiveness of group care. And child welfare and the Congress is located in the Senate Finance Committee and the House Ways and Means Committee. And they looked at the data, the cost of group care, and the outcomes that they were getting, and decided the federal government was not getting value for what they were spending in out of home care. So they passed the law in February of 2018, which says that as of October 1st, 2021, the federal government will only reimburse states for the first 14 days of group care unless one of the exceptions is met. So Florida's had, and the other states, 3.5 years to get ready. The pressure is on. So Florida has substantially reduced the number of kids who are in group homes. So this chart starts, you can't see it on the bottom, but starts in February, which was February of 2018, the month that the law was signed into effect, and goes to today. So you'll see there's a pretty good drop in the number of kids who are in group care. There's also been a drop in the number of kids in out-of-home care overall, but this is a drop. But then when you look at where that reduction is primarily in young people and children 12 and under. So the drop in the rate in the number of teens in group care is not as sharp a decline as it is for all children in care. And when we're talking about the federal government only being willing to pay for 14 days or less of group care, I think this slide should be of interest to folks. So this was based in a survey of group care providers that was done in April of 2019. DCF surveyed group care providers, and these were their responses for how long young people were in their group homes. And it's done by region. So across the bottom, you find the region that your community is located in, and you'll see that very few of the young people who are in group homes are in for less than 30 days. And then the length of stay varies greatly in some cases. But if you gotta have them in 14 days or less, this is a big hump to overcome. So, and the other just kind of piece of the cost and the cost benefit is to keep in mind is how much group homes charge per child. So this was in the same survey in February of 2019, and they reported their ranges. So 5% of the group homes charge between $1 and $50 per day per child. 44% are in the $100 to $150 range, and 25% $151 or more, 151 to 200. So that that's where our money is going now when we're paying for group care, the cost of care. Okay, let's switch over. How do we figure out who needs to be in group care? We'll skip that because I already gave the answer. Let's go back. Let's do this one. If you have participated in efforts to move children out of group homes because of Family First, what did you do? So if you've been part of that effort to reduce the number of young people in care, and this is an open-ended question, we just love to see what role you've had. So again, if you're just coming on, you need to either open another window or use your phone, go to menti, menti.com, and use the code 4671-2905. Great. I love seeing these answers. Great. So these are any activity you've personally done to help young people get out of group homes. Okay. Thanks. And you'll see at the end, there'll be an opportunity for you to have the results shared, pardon me, with everyone. So we'll wait a couple more minutes. I don't know if I can scroll down. Yeah. Reunify with parents, increase family finding. Lots of family finding, foster teens, increase foster home availability. Okay. All right, you'll be able to keep answering, but I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint. Okay, so here's where Florida stands overall. This is a slide that was created by DCF and shared at a February meeting of the Child Welfare Practice Task Force at DCF. So DCF has been working on this effort, and those of you that are in CBCs, you know they've been polling you, asking you what you're doing to reduce the numbers, you know, and how you're trying to encourage people to help them get current group home settings to become a Family First setting. So this is where this DCF was as of last month in its effort to align its placement array to be ready for October 1st. Okay, so we're at March 19th. The financial spigot cuts off October 1st. So I pulled out some of the numbers on just to make it easier to look at. So Florida projects right now we have 394 young people that they think are at risk of sex trafficking and a potential of 1,200 beds to meet that need. So excess capacity for that population of young people. 427 young people they think are eligible for qualified residential treatment programs. We're going to go into that in a lot more detail, but only 259 beds. So that's a major deficit. And 558 young people that they don't think are eligible for a family first setting that they need to find a home for. So, and that those numbers change, as time goes along, and a lot of really good work is being done. But that's where the state stood last month. So how do we meet the needs of kids without group homes? A lot of people will say these kids have intense needs. They really only can be served with the services available in group homes. How are we going to be able to do it? Well, let's see. Let me switch over. I'm going to ask just this intro question just to see how many of you know what the daily rate for foster care is. So this is the daily rate for foster parents of teens. So the rate for care is set by statute, and there's an automatic cost of living increase that goes into effect every year. Usually around January, the COLA is announced and the new daily rate for care is issued. So, because obviously putting kids in homes is a big part of the solution for those kids who will not be eligible for group care going forward. So I admire the enthusiasm of those 17 people who have identified $25 or $50 for average daily rate. The statutory rate right now is closer to 19. So no points for the winners, but good to know when you're right. Okay, so one of the main ways that we hope the state hopes to be able to serve more young people in homes is by providing enhanced services to level 2 licensed foster parents. So you may recall level 2 is what we used to just call licensed foster parent. That was it. They were the foster parents. They now are called level 2 because we can license relatives and non-relatives in a level 1 license. So DCF is working on a project to create a level 2 enhanced system that would be uniform across the state. As it is right now, many of the CBCs will offer enhanced rates to some foster parents to take kids who have maybe are more difficult to deal with. So the work group that's been working on this is working on a few major steps. These are items under consideration. They have not been finally approved. Some of it will result in rulemaking to put into effect, but this is kind of the working plan where it's at right now. So that would include an enhanced board rate, which would create a kind of a matrix of needs. Size of the sibling group. Is this a young person who's awaiting placement in a psychiatric placement or a step down? Is there DJJ involvement, sexual abuse history, etc.? And it would create a matrix with a maximum daily board rate per child per day at $150. So if you scored out in that matrix, with the possibility of it being more per day with a review and approval by DCF. So when you're looking at somebody and asking them to take a child with a significant needs and offering them $19 a day versus maybe up to $150 a day, you can see that you might be able to recruit and retain more people with better board rate. It would come with a mandatory foster parent training, and that they're looking at a couple of evidence-based models. Would not just be, retaking your MAP or PRIDE or whatever you're offering now, but really specific trauma-informed, evidence-based training for dealing with difficult populations of kids. They're considering incentive stipends for maintaining placements. If the young person stays there for 3 months, you might get $300. If they're there another 3 months, another $300. If you stay with them through permanency, another payment to really incentivize not, tearing your hair out and kicking them out. And also an array of services. So it's not just additional money, but there might be peer mentors, wraparound services, behavioral analysts, things that really can help sustain the placement. So that's one way that we could really move kids that have a lot of needs out of group care into family homes. And the other thing we can do is, when is a group home not a group home? Well, turn it into a family foster home. So, right now, under Florida law, a family foster home has to be 5 children, including the children of the caregiver, unless the family has a capacity waiver. Federal law, however, says that a family foster home can be 6 foster children and the children of the caregiver. So Florida changes its definition of family foster home. More, it could be up to 6 children in foster care. And if they can get up to $150 a day, which many of the group homes, that was the upper end of pretty big chunk of the rate, that would enable some of those family style group homes, smaller group homes, to be technically called family foster homes. So the law used to require that those family foster homes be private residents, and that law has already been changed. So a nonprofit provider that owns a campus that has separate houses on it can turn those houses into family foster homes, but they will have to be foster parents. They will not be shift staff. So that's one way of being able to move a population of people out of group homes into family homes with actually probably not moving them at all. So advocacy tips: when your kids are, stressed in their foster homes, having high needs that aren't being met, seek out the level 2 enhancements and services for your kids, additional payment for the caregiver. And, if they're going to do that, offer those services to licensed caregivers, advocate for those same services and support for the kids to stay in their own family home, whether it's if you're working with them in their home with their parents or with their relatives or non-relatives, fictive kid. So there's some real opportunity there. So that is what kind of the jumping into what we're doing to reduce placements. Christy, did you pop in? You have a question to answer?
Is it question time?
Yeah, I could take probably just one or two right now.
Okay. We had several questions come in. Let's see where to start. We heard that a residential campus with more than one home on the property, even being licensed as a foster home, was going to have a capacity cap as a whole.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about that. I think the questioner might be conflating the issue with qualified residential treatment placements programs on campuses. So I don't think right now that if there's a campus of cottages and the cottage becomes a family home, that there is a capacity problem. There is definitely capacity concern with QRTPs, and I will talk about that when we talk about QRTPs.
Okay. One more question about I think it was the group homes. I'm curious, the feds will only pay for the first 14 days. How many days have to be in between stays? Is that a monthly or yearly reimbursement?
I don't know the answer to that question off the top of my head.
Okay. All right. We'll save the rest.
Okay. So the law specifically is geared toward, the section of the law talking about group homes is called ensuring the necessity of a placement that is not a foster family home. Like, the feds really have put a lot of thought into requiring states to show that the young person needs to be in that type of placement for a treatment purpose. Again, not just because you can't find a place for them. So in order to do that, the states have to demonstrate that issue of need, and there are specific placement settings that are provided for in the Family First Law. And we're going to talk about each of these settings. So let me switch over real quickly. Okay, to Menti slide. All right. We're going to start talking about comprehensive placement assessments. And we hear a myth sometimes, myth or fact. Is the implementation of Family First the reason why we have to do comprehensive placement assessments when children come into care? Is it because of Family First that we have to do comprehensive placement assessments? It's so interesting to watch the numbers change. Okay, I think assessments required because of Family First is climbing up, but still outpaced by assessments required before. So, and the folks in the blue column are correct. Whoops, switch back. Yeah, I apologize for the tech. So Florida started requiring comprehensive placement assessments in July of 2017. If you recall, Family First was enacted in February of 2018. So we've had this requirement. I mean, I think Florida was looking ahead because Family First had, or something similar had been brought up before, but Florida had already required that the level of care that a child needs should match the most appropriate placement. So the when Family First requirement came in and specifically required that the states make sure that children aren't diagnosed just for the purpose of meeting a placement criteria, Florida was able to use the existing comprehensive placement assessments to meet that requirement. So every child is supposed to have an assessment at intake. So if the child, if the child's first time coming into care, and the CPI can find a relative or a non-relative to immediately place that child, that's awesome. But if there is no relative or non-relative placement, the CPI is supposed to ask the CBC, and hopefully you all know all these terms, but the child protective investigator has to ask the community-based care agency to convene a multidisciplinary team to get folks together to figure out what is the right setting. If we can't find family or close friends, what's the right out-of-home care setting? Those have to be done at intake. Likewise, that comprehensive placement assessment has to be updated if there's a change in the level of care that's recommended. If the child is with a relative, but there's a concern that they need more structure or need to move to a licensed foster home or other placement, the assessment has to be updated. And it's supposed to be reviewed every 30 days to ensure permanency. So we already had that requirement for comprehensive placement assessments. There are some bills right now that might flesh out more some of the requirements for these assessments. But as it stands right now, the multidisciplinary team has to have at least 3 people. There's a list of the people that can be part of it, and can include other people. And there's a list of things that they have to consider in deciding what is the right out-of-home placement for that young person if it can't be with family. So after the comprehensive assessment is done, then the search for appropriate placement takes place. The first type of Family First setting, so this would be a type of setting where the federal government is willing to pay for more than 14 days in a group care out of home. And that would be a placement with parents in residential substance abuse treatment. So the parents need to be in drug rehab. There's a facility that will let them live there with their children. The plans on effectuating this have not been finalized. So that's still a work in progress to come. The second thing that will exist in the new world of out of home care are what we right now would call traditional group homes, like these regular, what we have in group homes. And a traditional group home has to choose between two populations that it wants to serve, either young adults 18 to 21 or 22 with a disability, or children who are awaiting placement in another group care setting and that placement's been identified but isn't available. What does that mean? The young person has been assessed and is pregnant, is suitable for maternity home. Um, Maternity home has been contacted. Placement will be available shortly. That traditional group home can serve that young person again, as a as a transition. So, but I want to ask, let's start talking about the first population, which are, oh my goodness, you guys have already started answering. So in your community, do your group homes now serve that young adult population? So are there group homes in your community? And you can answer more than one in this one. Do some of the group homes let the young people stay after they turn 18? Are there other group homes that are specifically for over 18s? Does your community have group homes that kick them out when they turn 18? And whether or not you're sure. So again, you should be able to answer, hopefully, of the first three, more than one of those. So what's existing now? So kind of split. All right. I'm going to switch back over. Okay, so what we're calling these group homes for the young adults are, I got confused. I started to write subsidized independent living, which if you've been around for a while, you would know was something that kids were eligible for before at 16 to live on their own. We're not reinventing that. Supervised independent living, these would be placements for young adults in extended foster care. So there's no limitation on the length of stay if they're over 18. The federal government will pay for young people in EFC to live in group homes. There is an additional training requirement. So every group home staff has to have 40 hours of pre-service training. It will have an additional requirement of just 8 hours of additional skills for adolescents and transition planning. And then the services that those group homes have to offer are listed at the bottom. So what you may see is that traditional group homes in your community that aren't able to fit into any other family first provision may be willing to stay open as a traditional group home for young adults and then just take 18 to 21-year-olds. The transitional homes are those group homes that will take young people knowing that the federal government will only pay for 14 days or less. And they need to be the help in the transition to the next place. So there has to be transition planning that's initiated right away. They will be expected to coordinate the assessments if they're still trying to figure out what the needs are of the young person, coordinate the referrals, and the attempt to get services in less restrictive settings. So that would be in a family home, either a foster home, relative or non-relative, and help to assess the connections that children have with their families in order to, again, to find a family setting for them. So that's some chunk of existing group homes will become those transitional homes as well. Okay, so then the next population we talked about, again, an exception where the federal government will pay for out-of-home care is for pregnant and parenting young people. And I thought, we already have maternity homes. This actually, we haven't had a rule on maternity homes for about 2 or 3 years. The last rule in the rulemaking that talked about the requirements for maternity homes had been discontinued. There is a proposal for a new rule relating to maternity homes. And I should back up and say, when I talked about the traditional group homes a minute ago, There's rulemaking in process for all of these group care settings. The rules are not final. Um, DCF is in its rulemaking process, and things that are in here can change until final rules have been promulgated. But you know, I think we need to know and be prepared for what's coming around the corner. So the thing that stuck out the most to me is that the maternity homes can serve not only the pregnant or parenting youth, but also their siblings. I'm not aware of any that do that, but the possibility is there. There's a specific set of services that maternity homes, pregnant and parenting homes will be required to provide. I think many of them do this already. So that's the second type of setting. Excuse me. Now let's talk about, just check my time, qualified residential treatment programs. So this is a big one. And the people have been hearing about QRTPs, and let's just switch over and see, um, answer this question. Do the QRTPs serve a separate population from residential treatment centers, or is it the same population? Take a second to answer that. Okay. So, a little closer than some of our last questions. Excuse me. All right. Those of you in the pink, you are correct. All right. QRTPs are a new type of group home that are intended to address the needs of children that have emotional and behavioral needs. They are not an emergency placement. They are not a secure shelter, and they are not for acute psychiatric crisis. I'm sure many of you have had circumstances where you had a young person that you thought was suitable for a residential treatment center, and you were told, no, that the problem this kid is experiencing doesn't meet the criteria. It's a behavioral problem. So a lot of young people that have behavioral regulation issues that could benefit from intervention, this is the population QRTPs are intended to address. There are a lot of due process requirements in the federal law, and you'll see them in the rules that DCF is working on. So the first is there has to be a qualifying assessment. If the young person is over the age of 10, they can be put into the QRTP. So like the comprehensive placement assessment recommends QRTP. That child could be placed in the QRTP, and the assessment has to be done within 30 days. If the child is under 10, the assessment has to be done before the child is placed in the QRTP. There have to be goals that are determined, a specific tool, the child and adolescent needs and strengths, CANS tool, has to be used. And that assessment has to be completed by a qualified individual. That's what the rules are going to call it. The qualified individual, Florida has chosen to require that it is a licensed clinician or master's level practitioner under the supervision of a licensed clinician. They have to have experience with children and adolescents, no actual or perceived conflict with the QRTP. So these folks cannot be an employee or under contract with the group home that is the QRTP. They have to be conflict free with that. They most likely will have contracts with the CBCs who are asking for the assessment, similar to what they do with comprehensive behavioral health assessments. So the qualified individual has to look at specific things. The treatment record, they have to speak with identified parties and interview the child. The law requires face-to-face communication with the child. It can be done under video in some circumstances. And the rules go into some discussion about the attempt to have a good faith effort in engaging the child. It can't just be, I tried calling once and they wouldn't talk to me. There really has to be an attempt to engage the young person in that assessment. There are essentially three options that the assessor can recommend. placement in the QRTP, placement in a less restrictive setting with wraparound services. So remember, think about like level 2 enhanced or services offered to a relative. And they can make a recommendation that the child be placed in a residential treatment center, but only if the qualified individual is also a qualified evaluator. So when you're talking about placement in residential treatment and state inpatient psychiatric, those recommendations have to be made by a qualified evaluator, which is defined in Florida statute. I think it's 39407 that talks about placement in those facilities. So if the QI is also a QE, they can make that recommendation. Otherwise, they can recommend that the child be assessed for that level of care, but can't recommend it directly. So let's see what our question is here. Oh, that is not the question there. I'm going to switch it back to, sorry about that. Okay, so let's do a quick comparison of the QRTP and the RTC, Residential Treatment Center. So we talked about emotional and behavioral needs, and that QRTPs were intended to serve a separate population from the residential treatment centers. They're licensed under different statutes. Residential treatment requires a diagnosis of emotional disturbance or serious emotional disturbance. To place in an RTC, you have to use the due process in 39407, and residential treatment centers are funded by Medicaid so long as a qualified evaluator has made that recommendation. In the QRTPs, they're limited to children in DCF custody. They have to have emotional or behavioral needs, and they will be funded by Title 4E, which is regular foster care funding, if a qualified individual recommends and the court approves. So intended to be separate populations. So what happens if the qualified individual does not recommend? The case manager can ask the QI to do a reevaluation. They can provide additional information, either because something's changed with the child is decompensated, or if perhaps they didn't send a complete clinical record the first time. The multidisciplinary team has to come together and offer the treatment and support in the community, and the child has to be removed in 30 days. They have to be moved out of the QRTP if placement in a QRTP is not recommended. So they should be moved out into the community with support. There's an ongoing requirement of review for every 60 days. And the court has to review within 60 days. And then there's an ongoing 90-day assessment to determine whether the child still needs to be there. Because again, the feds want to pay for a limited intervention done at the time the child needs it and not any longer than necessary. So if the court orders a QRTP placement and there is no qualified individual recommendation, the case manager is going to have to ask for another one, because if the court doesn't approve it and change their mind, there will not be federal funding. So just like a residential treatment, a child can be placed there under court order, but if the Medicaid requirements aren't met, Medicaid's not going to pay for it. If the child stays in the QRTP and those requirements aren't met, the federal government's not going to pay for it. So again, at the ongoing assessment has the same components as the initial assessment, but also to document changes. The purpose of putting a young person there is to get the services and the treatment in order to experience change. So that should be included in the ongoing review. There is a maximum length of stay in a QRTP. For teenagers, it's 12 consecutive months or 18 non-consecutive. For 12 and under, it's 6 total months. The maximum can be exceeded, but with regional managing director oversight. So the idea is this young person needs a treatment intervention, they're going to get it. It's going to help them move on and move to a less restrictive setting. So that's the plan. So what happens if they leave, if they run away? If they return, either from runaway or Baker Act in 7 days, it's a continuation of the original placement. They can be moved from one QRTP to another without a new assessment. So, but if they're gone for more than 7 days, it requires a new evaluation to determine whether that is the appropriate setting for that young person. So my advocacy tip here is just that there is a lot of due process protection built into the law for both federal law and Florida law. So use them for kids. So I think I've got a decent chunk of time to answer questions here. Kathy, sorry, Christy, if you want to shoot me some questions, we could do that now.
Okay, is it okay to start from the beginning? We've got 9.
Start where you start. We'll see how much time we have.
So we're going to go back in time to the beginning at 128. And I don't know what this question means, so I'm just going to read it out to you, and hopefully you will know. HCV, family self-sufficiency minus HUD. Are we using this?
Not sure what that means either, so I can't answer
Okay.
that question.
I thought it was just me. So Betsy, if you want to clarify, just go ahead and type it in. So the next question, and this is for the special funding you mentioned at the beginning, does this include specialized therapeutic group homes or just regular group homes?
So specialized therapeutic group homes are an entity outside of the system. They are a Medicaid service funded by Medicaid. They continue to exist, and the changes to the federal law don't apply to them. They are still part of Florida's service array. We do not have a sufficient amount of them. They're not everywhere that children need them, but they are not affected by these changes because they're a Medicaid funded service, not a Title 40 funded service. Good question.
All right. And someone was asking how the Social Security Administration is looking at the new COVID funding. Like, will that affect benefits?
I believe that is addressed in the memo that we're including in the resources, and that it is to be disregarded, but I'm not 100% sure of that. So that is a good question to follow up on.
Okay.
I think it's addressed in that memo though.
Okay. And we had a couple questions about the driving assistance funding. Can that be used for car insurance, driving lessons, and driver's license fees?
So all of those things are currently covered under the Keys to Independence, and I would presume that any young person who's eligible for the Keys would need to go through Keys first to do that. But there are definitely young people who are not eligible under the statute for Keys who ought to be able to access that money for all of those things. And I didn't specifically include those items in the slide, because for young people that covered by Keys, they get that. But those things are specifically described in the memo guidance from the Children's Bureau. So yes.
Okay. And is there a specific form to use to apply for the new funding?
No, no, we're still waiting for DCF to say what they want to do, but don't wait. If you've got a young person that has a need, make your own form, make a motion, knock on the door, beg, do whatever you have to do, because kids can't wait for a form. So the money is there, be creative in figuring out how you could get it for them. Once there is a form, hopefully they will get it disseminated broadly, but right now there is not.
Okay. Do you have time for a few more?
I do.
Okay. The projections for the at risk of trafficking and QRTP seem low. Is there anything else you can say about how they come up with those projections?
So the projections that we saw were based, it's my understanding that they were based on survey that DCF conducted by making inquiry to the community-based care agencies and just asking them, on your list, how many meet those criteria. So we're going to talk more about the specific criteria for the additional types of homes, but So it was just a survey based on their responses of the CBCs.
Okay. Are there any conversations about providing enhanced rates to level 1 relative or non-relative caregivers so that a child could, for example, be with family but have more intensive wraparound supports?
So I don't think they're not. I haven't heard the term used, enhanced level 1, but there should be ways of obtaining those enhancements to help the children stay in those placements. The presumptive payment of the level 1 caregiver can be increased. It can be negotiated for more if the child has greater needs. And those types of services ought to be offered wherever the child is, not based on placement. So, um, no, I don't know that there will be a formal program the way that there is talking about for level 2, but yes, all of those services should also be available. You're
Okay.
just gonna have to figure out and ask for them.
Okay. It's a related question as the next one. Can these incentives be offered to fictive kin? This enhanced cost of living allowance.
Okay, so related, right now, they can ask for a greater board rate than they're getting now. The COLA, so it's a couple different things. There is not a COLA for level 1 caregivers. They get a flat rate. It's not raised every year. All of them have the ability to become level 2 caregivers, and we'll talk about that in a little bit.
Okay. Maybe we'll do one more. Can you go over the differentiation between the family foster home and the group home again?
Okay, so a home that has 6 or fewer children in foster care, parents that live there that are responsible for the 24-hour care of children, just like all of us are for our children. So that doesn't mean you're home all day. You could still go to work. But our parents responsible completely for the care of the children in the home can be considered family foster homes if even if the parents have other children of theirs who live in the home, even if the home that they live in is actually owned by a nonprofit. Um, the technically they get the board rate for that child because that's what foster parents do, right? Foster parents get a board rate. Um, so and there are currently small family style group homes. Those can be considered family foster homes. So hopefully that explains the difference. And I actually can take probably one more.
Okay, wonderful. We've got lots of questions coming in, lots of great information. How will SB 80/HB 1473 affect a home with sibling placement?
So all of the home capacity limitations can be waived for sibling groups, and that won't change. So for right now, I don't see any negative effect on what will happen with those kids. So remains to be seen with final passage.
Okay, great. And everyone else, I still do have your questions up here, so we'll try to get to those a little
Okay.
later.
I can do one more.
Okay. Are the comprehensive placement assessments supposed to be court filed?
I believe they are.
Okay.
Like 98% sure. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Robin.
Okay, keep those cards and letters coming. QRTPs, what do you get? So the first part, we talked about the process that was due and how you get in, but really specifically, you get treatment and a trauma-informed treatment model, individual plan, discharge planning, aftercare support. This is really important. This is intended to be a service that moves the child along, and all of those items have to be in place. So all kids in group care are supposed to get service plans. Kids in QRTP get treatment plans that have specific requirements to be a part of. Services offered at QRTP Federal law says time limited, high quality services. And this is the array of services that Florida expects will be offered in our QRTPs. I'm not going to redo the list. Another thing that's really emphasized in QRTPs is family involvement. They are to engage the family in family therapy, include siblings in the outreach to family members, document how families are integrated into the treatment process, document how sibling connections are maintained. This is, again, a QRTP is supposed to be a place to help a young person get regulated in a way that they can be successful in the community. And just like all of Family First, family is really important to that. And not just sent away to get treatment and then come back into the community and nothing has changed there. So it's a really important component of QRTPs. The QRTP, you heard earlier someone ask a question about capacity. QRTPs are limited to 16 beds, a maximum of 16 beds. They have required nursing care. There's required staffing requirements. QRTPs have to be accredited in a national accrediting organization. The issue with the 16 bed problem is that it is not clear whether QRTPs are what the federal government calls IMDs, which is Institution of Mental Disease. If it's an institution of mental disease, then there can only be 16 people on the entire campus. So if you have a QRTP with 16 beds, you can't be on a campus that has other licensed beds. States are handling this requirement differently, and it's up to the state to decide whether a QRTP is an IMD. But this is causing some consternation in getting facilities licensed as QRTPs. So that is hanging out there, but that issue just relates to QRTPs, not to the other types of group homes. The QRTP training regimen has a number of training topics that are to be included because, again, this is not housing, this is a therapeutic intervention. A key part of being in a QRTP is discharge planning. It's not just, okay, we're done with you, back to the community, but what are those ongoing needs? How are they going to be met? And it should involve the team of people outside of the QRTP that are going to continue working with the young person, as well as the young person themselves. And then it goes into aftercare. QRTPs are required to provide 6 months of aftercare to every child. What Florida has decided is if the child is moving more than 50 miles away from the QRTP, the aftercare support requirement switches over to the community-based care agency that's serving that child. But if the child's within the 50 miles, the QRTP is supposed to continue to provide those aftercare supports. And what those supports are listed on the slide. And that's just what I told you. The aftercare progress reports do go into the court record. You know, is this working? How are they maintaining in the community? Okay, so big advocacy tip here, really promote the family and the caregiver involvement during treatment and aftercare. Make it meaningful and make it so that it can continue on, likewise with the discharge planning process. Okay, so we're going to switch now to high quality residential care and support services to children and youth who have been found or are at risk of becoming sex trafficking victims. Okay, so that is, I put the statutory citation, that's the language used in the Family First Act. So what are those group care facilities? Let's switch over to a question. Does Family First require Florida to change the services that it is currently offering to trafficking victims? I put trafficking survivors, I think is a better way of putting it. So we know that there's a whole new separate section on trafficking. Does Florida have to change what it's doing? Give it another minute. Okay. Y'all can keep answering, and I'm going to switch back to the PowerPoint. Okay. Florida currently offers safe houses, and we have offered safe houses at least since 2012. Florida enacted its Safe Harbor Act, which says we have to look at anyone 6 or older who's suspected of being a victim of commercial sexual exploitation to determine the need for placement in a safe house or safe foster house. So we have been serving the population of young people who are suspected of or have been verified to be victims of sex trafficking. The Family First Act does not change or place any new requirements on the state of Florida. So we are in compliance with that section. It doesn't make anything new. It creates a license setting that the federal government is willing to reimburse for. So there is a current rule on safe houses. It's going to be moved and changed. And again, like all of the other rules, the rulemaking is in process. These are not final rules. But the plan for now is that safe houses would take children 12 and older. And with all of these age limitations, a waiver can be obtained. There are criteria for the safe house has to have an admission plan that describes intake and discharge procedures. So it's really critical here because young people who have been sex trafficked or human trafficked may have behaviors that are unpleasant for group homes to deal with. And they may want to exclude those young people because they don't want to deal with those behaviors anymore. But the rules suggest to them or require them to not use the trauma-related behaviors or coping mechanisms as a reason to deny the placement or discharge a youth, unless there's an immediate, imminent risk to safety or the stability of other residents. So trafficking victims will run away. They may lie, they may steal, and those should be expected behaviors and not a grounds for refusal or discharge. For trafficking victims, safe houses have very specific requirements: no more than 2 residents in a bedroom, a 1-to-4 staff ratio, 24-hour supervision. The staffer safe houses have to have specialized training, and there's a big list of the topics for the specialized training that they have to work in safe houses. There's a specific list of the services that safe houses have to offer to the young people who stay with them. And at discharge, they have to reevaluate the service plan, do the multidisciplinary staffing, and work with the trafficking liaison. So there's a process and a set of services that are required for the sex trafficking victims. And we're going to start to talk about the at-risk of sex trafficking group homes. And so question here is that a type of facility used in many other states? So you might have heard the term just at-risk group homes, but the at-risk is at risk of sex trafficking. Give that a minute. Okay. Well, so at-risk group home is a term that Florida came up with, and it is not a type of group care facility that is widely used in other states. I think other states are looking at Florida to see how we do it to decide whether they want to add that, but it is not an existing type of group home. So the QRTP, Qualified Residential Treatment Program, technically didn't exist as a category prior to the creation of Family First, but every state will have QRTPs. Um, and probably every state will try to serve victims of sex trafficking, but not every state is going to have at-risk group homes. It's a Florida creation. So the admission criteria for at-risk is 12 and older, again, unless a waiver is obtained. And the child has to meet the definition that Florida created for a child or youth at risk of sex trafficking. Florida's definition is an individual who experienced trauma, such as abuse or neglect and or maltreatment. So pretty much that would be every kid in foster care, that first part of it, because that's why they're in foster care, and presents with one or more of the accompanying risk factors. So the risk factors are either running away or homelessness, sexual abuse, sexual acting out behavior, inappropriate interpersonal or social media boundaries, family exposure to human trafficking, and out of home care placement instability. Um, so I call this the loophole you can drive a truck through, because really, depending on how you look at things, pretty much every teenager in foster care probably meets one or more of the criteria, especially as they are defined or not defined. So, and when we asked DCF in the rulemaking process for some clarification, they said the history of running away can include a young person who ran away or eloped, even if it wasn't even a night away. So if they're expected home at 4 o'clock, expected back at the group home at 4 o'clock, and they don't come in the door until 8 o'clock because they went to the mall instead of coming home, that's an elopement that can count as a runaway episode. The homeless criteria can include being homeless with a parent before they came into care. There is no definition of interpersonal and social media boundary. Is that is going to be left to the interpretation of the CBC with that right now, no definition. And likewise, placement instability will be determined by the CBC and based on each child. So I think that throws open the door to really most of our teenagers. We asked Professor Latham at the University of Miami Children and Youth Law Clinic to take a look at the data set that he had about the experiences of children in out-of-home care, and using very conservative figures such as 4 or more placement changes, things like that, and more than one runaway. He calculated about 50% of the kids in out-of-home care over the age of 12 would meet the criteria. So whoever asked the question earlier, it seemed like the number was low. I would agree with you with regard to this population of young people. I think they can be defined in a much broader way. So that's who is eligible for placement in an at-risk home. So, we talked about the services that are going to be provided to young people that we know were trafficked. So now let's look about how the group homes for kids that presumably we're putting in this intervention to prevent them from being trafficked, right? They're at risk, and therefore we must be saying we think we can prevent them from being trafficked by giving them this group home intervention. So there is no specific requirement or limitation on the number of residents in a bedroom. There's no staff-child ratio specified. Either house parent or shift model is appropriate. And of the 40 hours of pre-service training, 8 hours have to be focused on human trafficking. Without the same type of list that was in the sex trafficking safe houses. The services that are required are fairly generic to group care. They do have treatment and intervention on sexual assault, but mostly the same services you would expect of any out-of-home care provider. at the very end, they have programming related to the prevention of sex trafficking, including healthy relationships, interpersonal boundaries, community engagement. So, kind of a broad catch all of services. A treatment plan is not required, although a service plan would be required. So, what's missing from this? So, we know the whole purpose of this section of the law, the federal law, is to say that this out of home placement is necessary. And there's nothing in the proposed rules that require or promote any kind of finding that the placement in an at risk home is necessary. Doesn't say that less restrictive placements have been tried or that care can't be provided in a family setting. There's no requirement for that. There's no requirement to show that the facility is is capable of providing treatment and care for children who are at risk. There's no requirement of a trauma-informed approach. The staffing, there's no requirement for aftercare or transition, and no process to assure that continued placement is appropriate. There are no time limitations on it. So a young person has a maximum amount of time they can be in a QRTP, which has lots of treatment and services provided. There's no time limitation or service requirement in the at risk of group homes. So the advocacy tips here are make sure your kid has a service plan that meets their individual needs and describes how those needs will be met with the services provided. If you don't think they're getting making forward progress, or I'm not even sure what it is, being less at risk of being sex trafficked because of the services that they're getting, or more capable of maybe emotionally regulating themselves. That's not happening. Seek ongoing review and ask the court whether placement and services are required. Excuse me. So, yeah, so let me back up a second. I think, Kathy, I could take a couple of questions now, if there's some questions.
Oh, yes. Plenty of questions in line here. Is the state planning to use one comprehensive assessment effective October 1st, regardless of the type of recommended care?
Yeah, so there's an existing comprehensive assessment, and they're in the rulemaking process. They're revising it, but it's a form that's already available. And the point is that the assessment should lead to the recommendation as to the level of care. So it will be one form.
Okay. For QRTP, does the child have to be evaluated and recommended? I have a youth with lots of behaviors but refuses to participate in evaluations and therefore didn't get the recommendation for residential.
So, like I said, the rules require a level of attempt to describe the attempts at engagement the qualified individual must undertake, but a recommendation can be made if the child completely refuses. That is a possibility.
Okay. Are there funds available for children placed with relatives who took permanent guardianship to keep them out of foster care?
We're going to talk about that in a minute.
All right. Good preview. What impact will this have on DCF, CLS, their typical response that no appropriate placement is available, and with the result that the child lands in a more restrictive placement?
I'm not sure that I can answer that question. So, ideally, when we get to October, Florida will have a sufficient placement array so that every young person can go in the appropriate place. Practically speaking, is that, pie in the sky? Probably, because still a lot of work needs to be done to develop the placement array. So,
Is Keys to Independence available to those 18 and over?
it is available to those 18 and over who participated in it prior to age 18. And the law on that was changed, and I'm not going to say it off the top of my head because I don't want to say it wrong. But and there has been, and maybe somebody can put in the chat, either it has happened or there may be a bill that would permit young people in extended foster care to participate in it over 18. But if you left care at 18 and you're now 20, you cannot participate in keys. But right now should be able to access the new Chafee money.
Okay. And someone had a question about the licensing issues. Family foster homes and sibling groups don't end up with an overcap of the foster care licensing for family homes.
There would still be a requirement of the waiver for over cap if the home was not licensed for a large enough group.
Okay. And is there a list somewhere of how many beds there are for at-risk individuals?
So there's not a, well, DCF may have a list. I think what they've done is they've identified existing group homes and asked them if they're, which type of home they want to be under families first. And that's where they've come up with that bed capacity of over 1,200. So I've not seen it in the form of a list, but plainly DCF has been gathering that information. So possibly available from them.
Okay. One more question. I have a client in a placement that seems like a QRTP now. Should I be asking for the QI? I have struggled with these placements because they seem a lot like therapeutic group homes.
So technically there are no QRTPs now, and the rules are not in place to make them happen. So these procedures and the qualified individual and evaluation don't exist now. So it may be that they're in a therapeutic foster home or therapeutic group care, and those are Medicaid services, and there are some Medicaid rules and process that apply. But it's not the QRTP status yet.
Okay. And thank you to Jerry Glenn. He put in the chat, you can get keys for the driving for 6 months after permanency or turning 18. There is a bill pending to include kids in PESS, but it hasn't passed yet. Thank you, Jerry.
Yes, thank you, Jerry.
And one more question. Are there any requirements as to Florida kids being frequently placed at great distances from their county of origin?
So there are no requirements about that. Florida does have requirements about placing young people out of state, but not specific requirements about out of county. But of course, the whole point of community-based care was for communities to meet the needs of their kids. One would hope that they would be able to serve those needs in the community. But you can look on the DCF website. They under general services, planning and performance measures, you can get to the DCF dashboard and you can see how many kids are placed out of county, out of circuit, and out of region. So you can find all that data and see how your community is doing compared to other communities. There's no requirement or prohibition on that now.
Okay, thank you for all that information. That's all the questions at the moment.
Yay. Okay. So let's move along. Support for relatives and non-relatives. That was one of the questions that came up. So first, let's look at the support on entry into care. And I'm changing to the Menti. Okay. Myth or fact, relative caregivers must become licensed. Sorry, I didn't put an I don't know on this one. Yes or no? Myth or fact? So the no's are outweighing the yeses so far. Right, we'll let those keep coming in. Okay, so with relative caregivers, it's all about choice. They're not required to become licensed. There are many states that require relatives to get a foster care license to keep children in their families. As children come into care, that initial placement is done if a relative or non-relative is identified to take care of the child. It's done with an order that places the child in the temporary custody of those caregivers. And at that time, the caregiver should be given 3 choices: that they can take placement under the relative caregiver program, that they can become level 1 licensed, or level 2 licensed. And the When that law was created, DCF was directed to create a communication strategy, like the statute requires it, to let them know what the different eligibility criteria are, what the different payment rates are, what the requirements are for each of the program, and give them a description of the process to become licensed and contact for help to decide what they're going to do. So before we had licensure, before we had kinship guardianship, Florida created the relative caregiver program, and it's under 395085. It was later expanded to include non-relatives, but we still call it the relative caregiver program. Those payments are made under TANF, which is the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, what we used to call welfare. And so it's a totally separate pot of money than the normal 4E child welfare foster care funding. Only relatives, people related within a certain degree, are eligible for that child welfare funding. So the non-relatives get funding from the state's general revenue, just our tax money. When a child is placed with a relative caregiver or a non-relative, that person has the custody of the child, and the child remains in their custody unless an order changing placement is made by a judge. So there has to be a court hearing to change the placement. Florida, in order to take advantage of federal funding for relatives, Florida created level 1 licenses, where child-specific licenses for relatives and non-relatives that the statute calls fictive kin. And there's a statutory definition of fictive kin on the slide. So when we first, years ago, created the relative caregiver program, there was a concern that many relatives would not meet the licensing criteria to become foster parents. And Florida believed at the time that it would have to apply all of the same criteria to relatives as it does to people from the street who want to be foster parents. It became clear under federal law that Florida could waive non-safety requirements to do child-specific licensing. So a level 1 licensed caregiver does not have to meet all of the exact same criteria as a foster parent. Safety criteria can be waived. When Florida created this level 1 licensure, they set a board rate that is the equivalent of $333 a month for all ages. Just like the relative caregiver program, when a child is with a relative under level 1 licensure, the caregiver retains custody of the child, and a court hearing has to take place, a court order to change the custody of the child. But all people who take in children should also be offered the opportunity to become a level 2 foster parent. Those relatives and non-relatives that choose to do that have to take all of the same training. So I didn't mention before, but in level 1, I think it's about 8 hours of training that's required, as opposed to 30 hours of training that's required to be a licensed foster parent. But they could choose to be level 2. They would have to meet all of the licensing requirements. No requirements could be waived to take the level 2. Level 2 licensure is the board rate that's set by statute with cost of living increases. So the last increase was given in the beginning of January, and those rates they vary by the age of the child. However, if a relative or non-relative accepts the placement and becomes level 2 licensed, then technically the child is in the custody of DCF, placed in the level 2 home. And under current law, the placement can be changed without a court hearing. So that can be a factor that people might want to consider. Now, there is legislation pending this year that would require a hearing for any change of placement that would take away that difference. And I didn't mention, but for level, for all of those levels, Medicaid would go to age 26, as long as the young person, when they turn 18, if they're in an open case and they had Medicaid, their Medicaid continues to age 26. So that's the support that's available now. So pulling up a chart that is available on the DCF Child Welfare dashboard, and what you can see, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor, but um, the red line are licensed foster care placements. The orange line are relatives and non-relatives, or just relatives. Blue is non-relative. So the orange line that comes down, there are fewer relatives that have children, but more licensed foster care. And that's because of those level 1 licenses. So we still have a lot of kids that are staying with relatives. It's just increasingly more of them are getting the level 1 license. So that's the support and coming in. Now I'll back up a second. There was a question about, can they get additional support after permanent guardianship? And that's where we get into a case closure. So a case can be closed to permanent guardianship under 396221. And this is available to all levels of foster parents, not level 1, but level 2 through 5, and the relative and non-relative caregivers. Not the level 1 licensed foster parents, but everybody else that's had a kid. That case can close to permanent guardianship. This is what we've talked about, PG. It's happened for years. It's what existed before Family First, before the waiver went away. This was permanent guardianship. As long as the child had been there for 6 months or more, the case could be closed. The custody stays with the caregiver, but the court retains jurisdiction. So these are the cases with PG that someone could come in and ask to reopen, possibly to reunify, et cetera. The financial support that comes with the PG for these cases are, if the relative or non-relative was getting relative caregiver funds, those continue to age 18. But if the child was with a licensed foster parent board rate payments end at the time of the permanent guardianship. So, and then Medicaid continues for their children only to age 18, because they won't be in out-of-home care in an open case when they turn 18. So this support is kind of defined but limited, and there's not a specific program of support to get additional supports for people in that permanent guardianship situation, but there should be access to support through the community-based care agency to prevent a return into care. So while there's not a formal program of support, absolutely anyone in that situation should be seeking support from their CBC to prevent the kid from having to return to care. If the child's been in a level 1 child-specific license placement, that case can close to kinship guardianship, where the caregiver retains custody, the court retains jurisdiction, and that financial support stays at $333 a month. Although a higher amount can be agreed to if agreed to by the guardian and DCF through the CBC, but ultimately by DCF. So if the child has more needs, there is a possibility of getting higher support payments. The funds can also be available to put, if siblings join in that guardianship home, they can also receive the funds at the amount of $333 a month. There is an annual redetermination of need. I guess if your guardian wins the lottery and they don't need the money anymore, they could cease to get it. One of the benefits with closing to kinship guardianship is that this money is movable, so the guardian and the child can move out of state and continue to receive the funds. That does not happen under the relative caregiver program, because that welfare funding benefit money is tied to being in Florida, but it is available if the guardianship is done with a level 1. Kinship guardianship can extend to age 21 if the young person went into their guardianship between the ages of 16 and 18. So the guardianship was at their late teens. In order for that to continue, they have to do the same type of qualifying activity that they would do for extended foster care: school part-time, work part-time, um, or eliminate barriers to work. Young people cannot both receive PES and extended guardianship payments. So they can receive one or the other, but not both. Um, there's also extended adoption subsidies if the adoption was made also after the age of 16 and the youth is engaged in qualifying activities. And similarly, those young people cannot also receive PES. So they can stay home or move out, but the adoptive parent can continue to receive the funds. But if they elect to go into PES, the adoptive parent receives no more funds. Um, the, we do a whole separate training about the intricacies of these benefits. But in this circumstance, if the young person stays in, if they were in licensed care for 6 months of the 12 months before the adoption, their Medicaid can continue to 21. Otherwise, most Medicaid for adopted children ends at age 18. I know all of that is clear as mud. We have what we call an independent living benefits table. We are in the process of working with DCF to update that, and it will help you determine what benefits are eligible for each type of care. And we will share that as soon as the update is available. So your advocacy tips, the most important thing is to make sure that caregivers understand what the options and the opportunities are for the different types of licensing, because you don't want to be in the situation of, I had somebody call me 2 days after a guardianship order was entered and freaked out because the young person was going to be not able to get benefits that she thought they would because she didn't understand. So use our independent living benefit table to sort through all that and just make sure people are making an informed decision. They may choose something that will cut them off from benefits, but it's what they want. It's a family decision. That's fine. I'm not saying change how, you know, how they experience care. Just make sure everybody is informed about what they're doing. So I think I have time. I have a few minutes to take a couple of questions, and then I'm going to turn it over to Walter. Christy, are there some questions?
Yes, we've got two more that came in. If a caregiver is level 2 and if they want to take a relative or non-relative child into their home, it is my understanding the child would need to be a foster care child to get assistance, as the caregiver cannot be level 1 and level 2. Is that correct?
Well, if the child is eligible for care and they're already a level 2 caregiver, then the child should be placed with them. They wouldn't have that protection of that. If the child's placed with them in foster care, then the child could be moved as any foster child could be moved.
Okay.
Um, but it shouldn't prevent them from being placed. But I do believe it's correct that they can't be both level 1 and level 2. Although I can't say that with certainty, but that sounds right.
Okay. Is there a behavior modification program to support the foster family and care staff, and is it offered to the client?
So something labeled behavior modification, no. There's not like an existing benefit that you could just tap into. Many communities have behavioral intervention supports that are available at different ages and levels and types of engagement. So if a family needs, if a caregiver needs that level of support, then absolutely they should be asking the child's case manager for that assistance. So there's not like a checkbox that I can say that you can get that, but that type of service should be available to help kids stay safe where they are.
Okay, we had one more question. You may have answered it in your last slides. Oh, it just disappeared in the chat. It was about the GAP program. What about the GAP program? Does that extend into permanent guardianship?
So again, the GAP program will extend to 21 if um, the, the caregiver has to elect it, and the young person had to be put into guardianship after age 16, but it is available then.
Okay, great. That's it for questions.
All right, well then I am very pleased to introduce you all to my colleague Walter Hahnemann to talk about race equity and placement. Take it away, Walter.
Okay, well, welcome. So I wanted to look at the slides and let's see, let's get this. Okay, so if you could go back one slide, please. So disproportionality is a mathematical concept. It's just things are not even; they're not in balance. And when we look at race, disproportionality is proportionality should follow the population as it exists in that area, in your county or your city or your state. Disparity is something which focuses on outcomes. So disparity, race-based disparities are that the outcomes, because of racial disproportionality, the outcomes are poor. So, and I'm not controlling this, am I? So next slide. Okay, so in Broward County, we experienced a disparity, and we looked at all systems. We started talking with juvenile justice, we started looking at adult criminal, and realized that there was, we all know that there's disparity in outcomes in those systems. And so we started to ask ourselves the question, does that exist in child welfare? Do we have a problem in child welfare? And the resounding answer is yes. And you can get that information statewide. It's not just in Broward County or in Florida. Unfortunately, that disparity in child welfare outcomes and involvement exists throughout the nation. So we did, here's some numbers here that I put up. We looked at the population of Broward County, which is 30% Black. It's about 30% Black. And we realized that involvement of Black families in child welfare made up 67% of our child welfare involved families. And so that tipped us off right there. There's a disparity in the numbers, and there's a disproportionality in the involvement. So also we talked a little bit about, or Robin did, about human trafficking in Broward County. Again, with a 30% Black population, 56% of our youth who are involved in human trafficking are Black. So that tipped us off. There's a problem here. So we decided to come together, and the next slide is going to tell you how we got there. But we decided to put together a group of pilots that focus on whether we can address and what can we do to address racial disproportionality in child welfare involvement. So we have 2 zip codes that we use as pilot projects. And I'm going to just put this up here. In 2019, the removal rate for both those zip codes, the overall removal rate was 7.62%. In the pilot project, where we focused on race lens and race equity based child welfare services, and this is the removal. So we decided to just start with one portion of child welfare. It's too hard to just say we're going to change all child welfare in one swoop. So we decided to look at the removals, the kids that we were bringing into care, the families that we were bringing into care, not just the children, but when children are removed, the families brought into care. So we looked at 2 zip codes, and in 2019, after starting this implementation of this project, 7.62% for the overall removal rates in those 2 zip codes. For the 2 CPIS pilot project teams, we had 2 teams only in the exact same zip codes. When they used race equity, the number was only 1.56% for them. 2020, we see a very similar trend. The overall was 12.29% children removed in those 2 zip codes. But for the 2 teams, the 2 child protective investigators teams that were race equity trained and race equity focused, the removal was 3.4%. So next slide. How did we do that? That's the question. How and why? So like I alluded to earlier, we looked at the history of the county and the state. We looked at the data and we realized that we had a problem. And then we decided to come together. First, we came together, stakeholders came together in a race equity child child equity welfare work group. And that group, we came together. It was convened by our urban league, but we threw the door wide open for all stakeholders. So DCF, the Attorney General here, who is CLS and the rest of the state, but our CLS, the Child Protective Investigators, which in Broward is our Sheriff's Office, the Guardian ad litem, children's lawyers, regional counsel, because we wanted the parents involved, the bench, the court administration, Casey family, universities that were studying to help us study the analysis, and also to who are training the future CPIs and caseworkers. We all came together and decided that we would be part of a work group. So we supported and designed implementation of this pilot project for these two child protective investigators, two CPS projects at BSO. All the staff engaged in race equity workshop. And what does that mean? First of all, everyone in this big work group committed to some principles. We committed to being intentional with each other, to say the words, to have a safe space for each other, but not necessarily a comfortable space. It was safe, but not necessarily comfortable. And we agreed to hold each other accountable. And we in our group don't call people out, we call each other in. We call each other in with intentionality to address this problem of race equity. We also made sure that not only were everyone on the workshop, on the work group trained, but each protective investigator in the two pilot projects went through a race equity workshop. It's a 2-day workshop, and they went through this process. And then we designed and implemented a process. We realized that also to be intentional in our work, we needed to have engagement, authentic engagement with parents and with young adults who had lived experiences in the child welfare system in those two zip codes. So we went out, we got authentic family engagement. We have parents who sit as equals on our advisory board. So it's not just system professionals, but it's people who have lived experience. And we targeted with the child protective investigators to get involved with those families. So when a call comes into the hotline and the child protective investigators goes to that family, they go with a agency, which is local. When I mean local, I mean the agency is actually in the zip code. That's where the office is. We provide services, and then we send a peer advocate with that team as well. And the child protective investigator, the peer advocate, and that agency all discuss and they consider not whether, but how they can prevent removal. Of course, there are times when removal cannot be prevented, but they look at, and they all look through everything that they're doing is very intentionally to look at, is there a race bias going on? Is there implicit bias? What implicit biases are being used by the child protective investigators, by the CLS attorneys, by the law enforcement who show up maybe and give the information, or even of that as a caller. We also targeted the agency, that agency to work with the peer supports to work and to investigate and determine what the protective factors are. So we switched our focus from risk, what are the risks, to what are the natural protective factors, and how can we bolster the natural protective factors to minimize the risk. And we have a second portion of that too, which is that the agencies involved, so the DCF, the CLS, the Guardian, the Regional Council, our CVC, the Urban League, all of the providers, the family support providers, all of the contract providers also agreed in writing. We committed in writing to the process, and then we went through a agency self-assessment to determine where our own implicit biases were showing up in our work. And then we developed guiding principles which direct each agency to change the way that they provide their services, our daily work, so that we can ameliorate bias and the implicit bias and the racial disproportionality in the work we do. Then the whole group comes together and we have guiding principles for the entire work group. So the entire work group has guiding principles that we adhere to and hold each other accountable to make sure that our removals are being done through a race-neutral lens. And all of this talk takes you back to the slide before, where we have actually shown in these 2 zip codes, we have these 2 targeted teams have significantly lower removal rates. And that's the work we've done. That work needs to translate on into the rest of child welfare, including group home placements, out-of-home placements, out-of-home care, reunification. All of this needs to be addressed through a race equity lens. So any questions for me? Mine was not nearly as statutorily technical as Robin's, but I would be happy to take any questions on what we're doing here in Broward and how it not only can be, but how it needs to be. It absolutely needs to be replicated in the state of Florida.
Definitely. That's really amazing, those results. What a huge
They
difference.
are. So it was really interesting because in those 2 zip codes, one thing we found, they're both very non-diverse. They have a low diversity rate. And what do I mean by that? And this is, again, this intentionality of language. Diversity is a mathematical concept. So when people say, oh, well, so-and-so is diverse. Well, a person cannot be diverse. Diverse is just a mathematical concept, and it should not be used as code for Black or brown or indigenous or any other minority group. That's not what diversity is. So these 2 zip codes have a very low diversity rate. They're like, one of them is 80% American Black, as opposed to one of the other zip codes, which is much higher Caribbean Black. And we looked at that zip code, which is about 80% Black and then about 20% white. Those same families live in the same housing opportunities, the same housing stock. Their kids go to the same schools. They have the same access to public transportation. They have the same access to healthcare, mental health care. All of the services in those zip codes are the same. And several years ago, for example, one of the highest reasons for removal in that zip code were for conditions. But when we looked, even dug deeper down into that, to those numbers, we realized that while 20% of the population were white, you would expect that 20% of the conditions removals would also be white. And the answer was 0 removals for conditions for white families from that house, from that zip code. Those are the kind of numbers that you look at and they make you say, you know what? We can't dance around this issue any longer. We have a problem in child welfare when it comes to racial disproportionality and racial equity. And we're just harming future generations. And we're not only harming, let's be clear, we're also not only harming future generations of Black and brown families. Systemic racism affects everybody. Everybody. White people like me, who are the inheritors of the doers of systemic racism, need to get past this as well.
That's really interesting. I learned so much from both of you, although I'm still not clear on all the acronyms, Robin, but I'll get there eventually. I just need about 20 more trainings from you, I think. We got lots of compliments in the chat box for both of you for a great training. I do have a couple questions that came in. Did Broward consider a blind decision-making process?
Yes, actually, we did. So there are some jurisdictions where blind decision-making has been done. And blind decision-making is, if I can make it some short, I guess the child protective investigators will go out, they'll get, sometimes it's actually crunched into numbers. They'll do a rubric for income, substance abuse, domestic violence, in number of incidents or whatever. And then you have this rubric, and then that rubric of that information goes to another group of people that do not know the racial makeup of that family, or if it's other decisions that you want to be blind to, whatever it is, they don't. And then they just make up that decision based on that pure information. And we did consider that. We actually struggled with that. But then we realized that to be colorblind doesn't help you solve the problem. We need to be more intentional and aware about what the implicit biases are, because when you do a blind analysis, the information that's being input is still going through someone's implicit bias, right? When they get you that raw data.
Right, that makes sense. Someone was asking if your group works with race equity for the Hispanic population, especially immigrants. I find this group has been targeted recently.
So in general, the answer is yes, but the numbers that I've presented, we have purposefully kept it very controlled so that we can measure what's going on. But the answer is yes. It's not just Black folks, it's Black and brown and immigrant populations too, who are the subject of implicit bias and racial disproportionality.
Okay. Have you noticed a reduction in, and I'm not sure what these acronyms stand for, but RED/DMC of crossover youth in those two zip codes?
The crossover youth, the answer is no, and hopefully the answer is going to become yes. But the reason the answer is no is we're keeping it narrowly tailored just to removals. And so the crossover youth are typically already involved in the system. But I'm assuming the answer is going to be yes. The same skills that we're using and bringing to removals will transfer into crossover prevention, will translate into out-of-home care facilities. It'll translate into all of that.
Okay. Are you following any federal standards?
We're still, of course, following the legal standards that are required for child protection, but no, we're not. This is really a homegrown initiative. We have turned to the Casey Family Foundation for guidance. We've turned to the Race Equity Institute, they're both national organizations. But when you say federal standards, we're not following any federal standards. And in fact, I'd say that the federal standards in place have gotten us to where we are now, which is racial disparity, racial disproportionality and disparity.
Great point. One more question. Were the investigators in the pilot program racially diverse?
Yes, they are racially diverse. They're Black, brown, and white.
All right, I think that's it for questions. If anyone has any follow-up questions for Robin or Walter, type those in quickly. And I think, Robin, you have a CLE slide.
I have a little more information.
Oh, okay. Well,
yeah, okay. So just to back up, I have put, sorry if this isn't right. This is the cover page for the resource material that you'll get. I just wanted to walk you through what items are in that. So the first thing is a tip sheet that was put together by Juvenile Law Center and Kids Voice in Pennsylvania with ideas of how you can implement those older youth provisions. Since Florida doesn't have any forms or process, you can see what some other folks are doing. The second is the specific guidance issued by the Children's Bureau on supporting youth and older children in the pandemic. And that will have those details about, I believe, about Social Security, about the things you can do with driving, lots of details in that document. The third item is called the Family First Legal Guide. This is a new work from the American Bar Association Center for Children in the Law. It's directed at attorneys and judges and walks you through key decision-making points and how what you do as a lawyer will affect in the Family First Act. Hopefully, we'll be doing some more specific training on that, but that guide just came out and we wanted to include it for you. The next item is called Seizing the Opportunity, 10 ways to advance equity and promote well-being through Family First. And the last item is the piece I talked about that came out yesterday that talks about who's eligible in the state. So that's the materials that you will be getting. The next slide, and again, you'll be getting this in writing, are the CLE credits. We got 3 credits of juvenile law certification and a half a credit each on bias elimination and mental illness. So, and at the end of the slide presentation, you will see our contact information. So that will be all sent out to you. And we've got a couple minutes left. If people have questions, we would love to hear from you. And I'm sure no one would object to leaving early if
get out of school early. Well, we had lots of compliments come through in the chat, so I'll be sure to send that to both of you because it's been a wonderful training. A couple people have asked about certificates. I don't have a way of generating social work certificates or anything from Zoom, but if you email me, I can confirm you attended if that helps at all.
So we can do a certificate of attendance if you send us the list of names that people want a certificate of attendance. Like if you're a guardian ad litem and you just need proof that you attended, we can generate that in our office. We just need the list of folks, and we're happy to do that. It's only accredited for continuing legal education, though. We don't have other accreditations.
One day I'll figure out how to get accredited for other things, but for now we at least have the CLE. And you all can email me if you need one of those certificates. There will be a bit of a delay. I am finally taking vacation next week, but I will get to it when I return. Let me see if we had a couple questions.
Christy, can I add, there was one question, I think it was addressed to me about will there be further information or outcomes coming out? And the answer is absolutely. Our work here in Broward, we're not keeping it just to Broward. And as we develop and get more outcomes and then branch out into other areas of child welfare, we'll be presenting this information in many different forums. Absolutely.
That's fantastic. I'm sure a lot of people would be interested in replicating it. And I was just thinking, Walter, I need to sign you up for another training about how to do this in other jurisdictions. Watch out. Once I get a hold of you, I don't let go. And some people have asked if we'll have the recording that will be sent out tomorrow, the recording, the CLE information, the PowerPoint, the resources that Robin mentioned. And if you'd like to watch the training that Robin did for us last year, it's on the YouTube channel. And I think that's, oh, wait, I see another question coming in. Oh, happy birthday. Oh, thank you. It was yesterday, but thank you.
Okay. Happy birthday. Thank you, Christy.
Thank you. I figure I haven't aged for 2 years now because this is my second COVID birthday. So yeah, I'm not counting this one or last one. That's my method.
Holy cow.
Well, thank you guys so much for all this information. I really appreciate you sharing it with all of us statewide. And I hope we'll be able to do this again soon.
Bye, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.